Moduls Rīga piedāvā.
You said you're working all your life in publishing.
Yes.
That means how many years?
Quite a long time. I joined the publishing industry immediately after I graduated in 1968. So I started to work at Cambridge University Press. That was my first job.
So you can tell us what has changed in this business?
Well, many things have changed. Most of my work has been on the educational and academic side rather than mass market publishing. But I suppose the biggest changes have been digital, and that started to affect the publishing industry much earlier in the academic sector than in the mass market sector. They started to publish electronically in the early 1990s, originally on CD-ROM. And this was really affecting academic journal publishing. And it was only much later that mass market publishing started to look at areas like e-books, because it was affected by the availability of e-readers or tablets. That wasn't really crucial to the academic publishing community. So that's really been the biggest sea change, I would say, over the years.
And in terms of copyright legislation, what changes?
Well, I mean, that has also been affected, of course, by the implications of the digital environment. And it's been, I suppose you would say that there is a school of thought amongst a lot of sectors, I mean, not just the public, that everything on the internet should be free. And it's not confined to young people wanting to download music free of charge. To share music, to download videos. There's also a feeling perhaps in the educational sector that everything should be free of charge. And the implications of that, if it's not covered by copyright, would be disastrous for the publishing industry. It's all very well to think that things should be free, but someone has to invest in bringing the content to the market in the first place. And the creators have to be paid, whether they're rock musicians, whether they're filmmakers, whether they're publishers and authors of publishers. So there is a feeling amongst some sectors that copyright hasn't kept pace with the digital environment. I'm not sure that I would agree with that, because copyright has been regularly updated to take account of many developments. Radio, film, television, all of these things didn't exist when the Berne Convention was drawn up in 1886. So copyright has moved with the times, I believe. It's a question of convincing perhaps the public that copyright still applies in the digital environment. Well, I wouldn't expect the general public to be totally familiar with every clause of either the Latvian Copyright Act or indeed the British Copyright Act, which is, I think, much longer. We have a very long history of copyright legislation. Ours was the first copyright law in the world, 1710. So we have had many different versions, and it's a huge document. I wouldn't expect the average teenager to be familiar with it. But I think there is a real need to perhaps have some kind of education to the general public that one shouldn't assume that everything is free. And certainly the publishing industry has made some initiatives in that area. They've tried to provide education in schools, for example, so that from a young age, kids get to realise that somebody has to be paid along the way. I mean, creators have to make a living. And if copyright went away, I'm not quite sure how creators would be able to survive. Writers would like to make a living from their writing, musicians would like to make a living from their music. Perhaps the difference with the music industry, I make a lot of comparisons, is that even though there has been huge piracy in the music industry, it has perhaps encouraged people to go to live music events. So some musicians perhaps can make a living. I'm quite sure the Rolling Stones make a great living from their concert tours. And perhaps it isn't...
And T-shirts.
Yeah, well, indeed. But I'm not sure you can apply that model to writers. I don't think you could expect writers to go out and make a Rolling Stones type living by reading from their works. So I think the publishing industry is particularly concerned about the erosion of copyright. I mean, not only for mass market books, but I think particularly on the educational front, where there's been a lot of pressure from the educational sector to say, why should we pay for content for our students? The content is usually written by people teaching at our schools and universities. And certainly we had some proposed changes to our legislation in the UK last year, which started to move towards a feeling that all educational content should be free of charge. Well, if that is the situation, I would say within 10 years, the major educational publishers will be bankrupt, and there will be no content to make available free of charge. Perhaps the whole dilemma in the digital age is the balance of interest between the user and the creator, and of course the people who represent the creators, who would be the record companies, the publishing industry, the filmmakers. One needs to arrive at that balance, but I'm not sure that you can arrive at that by simply saying that everything should be free, because it will disincentivize some people to create. I mean, we feel that we've tried to move the legislation with the times. Let me give you an example. In Canada, I think it was 2 years ago, they passed legislation which said that educational content was accepted from copyright. The result is that several Canadian publishers have gone bankrupt. The system in place which paid authors for partial use of their work through photocopying or scanning now doesn't cover educational content. And the result is that the Canadian publishing industry is shrinking. You might say the American publishing industry is not so far away. But that change to the Canadian legislation is now being held up as an example. So, for example, Ireland, Southern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, is starting to say, maybe we should do something similar because Canada has done it. And the erosion of high quality content. Of course, any creator can choose to put their content free on the internet. If they don't want to be paid, let them put it up there, that's fine. But it's not necessarily the best content. I think publishers would see themselves as curators of quality. We try to publish the best material, whether it's for the mass market or whether it's for educational purposes. Everybody now can self-publish, but there's an awful lot of rubbish out there. If you destroy publishers, then of course everybody is free to put their content up there free of charge. But I think that would be a very sad situation, because it won't ensure that the best quality material is published. Well, I think most publishers don't like to feel that projects in which they and the creators have jointly invested creativity and time and money are up for grabs, unless the creator chooses to make them so. And for example, some authors may choose to make the whole of their work available on Creative Commons licenses. They're completely entitled to do so, but they won't find a commercial publisher. I mean, it's their choice. If they want to put their content out there free of charge, of course anybody can do that. But if they make a commercial arrangement with a publisher, whether it's for a novel, whether it's for a children's book, whether it's for an academic book, then it's really a partnership with the publisher. And quite frankly, for many books, what the author sends in bears not much resemblance to what comes out at the other end. I mean, I speak from the view of an academic publisher, where our books are very heavily designed, for example. A huge investment is made in taking the author's content and putting it out in a form which enables the student to learn from it. So the whole layout, the design, doesn't come from the author at all. It's an investment by the publishing house. And that's why, for example, piracy of that kind of book on the internet, which is often done not for profit, but by students, who just say, why would you pay this textbook publisher $70 for the textbook? Here it is for free, and they put it up online. Of course, that completely undermines the investment that the publisher has made in bringing the author's work in the most usable form to the market, for which the author will be paid, but not when it's pirated online. And often these books are not actually pirated in digital form. It's not a piracy of the ebook. It's actually scanned. So the student will have stood there scanning 800 pages of a book, a textbook, and saying,
he invested his time.
Yes, he invested his time, and he says, here it is for free. But you know, if you take that to the extreme, publishers sooner or later will not be able to bring high quality books to market.
why textbooks are so expensive nowadays?
I think you'd probably have to ask American publishers that, because their books are particularly expensive. Largely because they are expensive to produce. They involve a large team of people. And one of the arguments of the universities, why should we pay for content? I mean, I think our response would be, as a university, don't you pay for electricity? Don't you pay for heating? Don't you pay for facilities? Why would you not pay for content? The assumption that content should be free is a strange one to me, because it's involved huge investment of expertise, for example, in the academic sector. And although many academic authors don't live by their writing, they're mainly teachers, and they're writing, if you like, in their, quote, spare time, unquote. Nevertheless, why would you expect someone to produce a huge textbook and not receive a reward for it? So, I mean, when publishers take action against piracy, it's not only their own interests that they're trying to protect, it's the interests of the authors. There was a recent survey done by the Society of Authors, which is the closest we have to an authors' union. Mm-hmm. Now, most of the people who belong to that would be people writing for the mass market, people aiming to earn a living from their writing, as opposed to academic authors who are earning their money mainly from academic teaching. And I think the average earnings of an author in the UK were, I think they were less than £11,000 a year. Well, I mean, that's not a living wage in the UK. Recently there's been a big initiative to try to persuade, for example, if an author goes to a school to talk to children, that they should receive a reasonable fee for doing that. So, I mean, actually, I think a lot of authors don't earn very well in the UK from speaking activities. Mm-hmm. I mean, they would regard it as supplementary income. So, they hope to make money from the actual royalties from their publications. But of course, that comes only with established success. When you're writing perhaps your first novel, the print run will be small, the sales may not be very good, and it's really only when you build up a reputation as an established author that people can make very substantial sums of money. Actually, surprisingly, a number of academic authors make quite a lot of money from their royalties, because if they are the authors of a major textbook which goes through many editions, revised regularly, and perhaps it's the key title for a particular subject area, then their royalties are quite substantial, in addition to the salary that they get from their academic teaching. Authors are free to self-publish if they wish. Some of them have done so very successfully. Some have then been taken up by commercial publishers. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey is a very good example of that. It was first self-published and then taken up, and of course has been an enormous mass market seller. I don't think the books are very good, but that doesn't necessarily mean they won't sell. So some people may continue to do that and say, well, it's now quite easy to self-publish, and then any money that they make is entirely theirs. There is no publisher taking a share of the revenue. But I think the majority of authors would probably prefer to be published by a traditional publisher, because then they have the brand of the publisher behind them, they have the marketing activities, they have the international reach of the publisher. The publisher will send them on author tours, possibly. This would be for mass market authors only. They generally have a much wider range of publicity if they have a brand behind them. But for that will mean a partnership with the publisher, of course, and the publisher will need to recover their costs for doing that. But I mean, any author is free to self-publish. There's a saying, everybody has a book in them, to which many publishers would reply, and many of them should stay there. But I remember once I sat in a conference, and this was 20 years ago. I sat in an academic conference where an academic stood up and he was complaining about the length of time it took to have an academic article published in a well-regarded journal, largely because the journal was looking at hundreds of articles, and then the articles have to be peer-reviewed. And this was in the early days of use of the internet. So he said, I can just put my article on the internet and it can be read by all the people who need to read it. And he said, the internet is a wonderful thing. My 8-year-old son can put material on the internet. And at the back of the room, a voice from a publisher said, exactly. In other words, there's no quality control. I mean, you don't even know where the material has come from. How can you be sure that something appears on the internet is by the name on the article? How do you know someone hasn't just copied it? I mean, there is no quality assurance. And I think this is what publishers increasingly have had to spend time doing, to remind people that that's what they're there to do, to filter a lot of very bad material so that only the best material is published. And in many cases, to help the author produce the best possible manuscript. I mean, I see manuscripts coming in which need a great deal of editorial work for them to be publishable. And that service comes from the publisher. And then there is the marketing and the ability to reach internationally, which, yes, of course, you can do it on the internet if you self-publish. I mean, there are no borders, if you like. But I believe publishers still have a real role to play, and to ignore them, to try and push them out of the picture, I think is a very dangerous thing to do. It is an old industry. My own company, the one I worked for finally, was originally established under the name of Longman in 1724, and it was the oldest commercial publisher. And it's continuing to this day, although the name has changed over the years. The two oldest houses are Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press, and they were both founded in the 15th century, so they have an enormously long publishing history. Macmillan, which was a family company, was founded in the early part of the 19th century. I suppose the biggest changes that have happened is consolidation. So publishers have formed into large groups, perhaps small literary houses which founded by one person, are now part of big groups like Random House or HarperCollins. But I would say it's a kind of never-ending circle, because what happens is that people who work for the big conglomerates perhaps become disillusioned with working for corporations. They leave. They set up their own companies, they start all over again. If those small companies become successful, then they are bought by the larger companies. And I would see it as perhaps, I'd like to think it was a never-ending process. I do quite a lot of consultancy for something called the Independent Publishers Guild, and the publishers who belong to that, some of them are just one or two people working from their homes. Some of them have grown to be successful, and some of them have indeed been bought by the bigger corporations. So that's probably the most significant feature. Mergers, acquisitions, for example, Macmillan has recently merged with Springer. That will be an enormously complicated integration. My own company, Longman, bought Addison Wesley, an American publisher, and then bought Prentice Hall. It was a $4.2 billion acquisition. It took 4 years to integrate the two companies. And that has a high price in terms of people. It alters the culture of the company. And I think both in probably the United States and the UK are the two markets where this has been the most significant change. It's happened also in Germany too, but it's not always a pleasant process to have your company taken over. I mean, in my case, I was always working for the company who was doing the taking over, but it was always a very complex process.
But it's still possible to establish a new company.
It is, many people do, and one of the delights I have of working with the independent publishers is that it's so different from big corporate publishing. I feel perhaps sometimes a little sad when a company like that grows. It attracts the notice of the big corporations, and then suddenly someone who has perhaps championed independence is made an offer that they can't refuse and sells the company. But there will always be people who start up again, I think.
How do you see the future of books and of copyrights?
Well, perhaps books first. I don't believe printed books will go away. And although in the English-speaking countries, e-books have taken quite a chunk of the market. I mean, it's about 20%. In the UK, it's a bit higher in the United States. The proportion of books read in e-book form is relatively small on the continent. I mean, surprisingly small. If you look at figures for, say, France or Italy, I don't think it's gone over 5% yet. It's a bit higher in Germany. But all the predictions which were made some years ago that by now 50% of the market would consist of e-books haven't come to pass. And I think there are many categories of books where people actually still want to own them as physical objects. I mean, they want them as beautiful books. I mean, perhaps art books. Many children's books people prefer to have in print form. What did happen, of course, was when the iPad became available, or tablets generally, illustrated books then became more possible to transform into digital form than on, say, something like a Kindle, where the screen was originally only in black and white or the screens were too small. But I don't believe that printed books will go away. I think there will always be categories where people want to own them, want to display them, want to handle them. And I don't think it's just something for the older generation. I've spoken to younger people who say, I like to hold a book. So I don't think the print book will go away. As far as copyright is concerned, I think it has to keep evolving to keep pace with technological developments. I mean, it's already done that. It doesn't guarantee that the general public will pay attention to that. But I mean, to say that copyright hasn't kept pace, I think is quite wrong. I mean, when you think of original copyright legislation, it didn't envisage films, it didn't envisage television. Over the years, it's evolved to cover that. And most developed countries have in their legislation something which seeks to make it very clear that copyright exists in the digital environment, that it is an offence to infringe it digitally, it's an offence to circumvent technical protection measures. Convincing the general public that that is the case, probably we will never do, but I think we have to lobby to do that. And in particular, we do a great deal of government lobbying in the United Kingdom. I can't think of a period of time like the last 5 years. We have had 4 major scrutinies by our government of the copyright system. To the extent where you feel, why are they asking about it again? We've explained it all before. It seems to need constant lobbying. On the whole, the latest revisions have been relatively acceptable, I think, to the content industries. I don't just mean the publishing industry, but also the music industry, the film industry, and so on. But it will continue to change. I don't think it's dead. And I think we have the means to revise it as and when it's needed. Well, I'm hoping that when I'm here that I'm going to be helping my Latvian colleagues to prepare for the London Book Fair, and the hope is that we can give them some practical help on how to perhaps identify Latvian titles that have international potential, so when they come to the London Book Fair they will have some offers for, not just for British publishers, I mean it's an international fair, but the complication is normally, for example, dealing with English language publishers. They're hesitant to translate books, particularly from less familiar languages. So there are some practical things to think about, whether some sample translations should be prepared, to try and identify books that really have an international appeal. And what areas of books may be most attractive to foreign publishers. So on Monday I'm going to be running a workshop where I hope we can help with that. And we're certainly looking forward to the Baltic States being represented at London. And I think it will give a really good showcase for books from this part of the world.